The dusty saloon fell silent as the doors swung open, revealing a crowd of jeering townsfolk dragging a frail woman in a tattered wedding veil. Her wheelchair creaked under the weight of their cruelty, her eyes cast down, unseeing but feeling every barb. At the altar stood Caleb, the cowboy whose heart was as wide as the Wyoming plains, his face paling as the townsfolk roared with laughter. They thought they'd broken him with their vicious prank, a paralyzed bride for the man who dared to defy their corrupt grip on the town. But Caleb's steady hands reached for hers, and in that moment, something unspoken passed between them. This wasn't the end they'd planned for him. It was the beginning of a story that would raise them both higher than anyone could imagine. Caleb had never been one to bow to pressure. A rancher with a stubborn streak, he'd come to Bitter Creek 5 years ago, buying land the town's elite had wanted for themselves. His refusal to sell, coupled with his quiet defiance of their underhanded tactics, had made him a target. The townsfolk, led by the venomous Mayor Hargrove, saw Caleb as an outsider who didn't know his place. When Caleb announced his search for a wife to share his life on the ranch, Hargrove saw an opportunity to humiliate him. They'd found Ellie, a young woman abandoned in a rundown sanatorium, her legs useless from a childhood accident, her spirit nearly crushed by years of neglect. They dressed her in a mockery of a wedding gown and paraded her to the saloon, expecting Caleb to recoil in shame. Instead, he knelt beside her, brushed the veil from her face, and said, "If you'll have me, I'll have you." The crowd's laughter died in their throats. Ellie's life had been a series of losses. Orphaned at 10, she'd been shuffled between institutions, her dreams of dancing or running through fields buried under the weight of her disability. By 23, she'd learned to expect nothing from the world. When Hargrove's men pulled her from her bed, promising a new life, she'd sensed their malice but had no strength to resist. Now, sitting before a stranger who looked at her not with pity but with resolve, she felt a flicker of something she hadn't known in years, hope. Caleb's voice was low, steady, as he asked her name. "Ellie," she whispered, barely audible. He nodded, as if it were the most important word he'd ever heard. The first weeks on Caleb's ranch were fraught with challenges. The house, built for a solitary man, wasn't suited for Ellie's wheelchair. Doorways were too narrow, floors uneven. Caleb spent evenings hammering ramps, widening passages, his hands blistered but uncomplaining. Ellie watched, torn between gratitude and fear. She'd never been cared for without expectation, and part of her braced for the moment Caleb would tire of her. The townsfolk didn't help. They spread rumors that Caleb's charity was a front, that he'd soon abandon his broken bride. Hargrove's men rode by the ranch, shouting taunts, spooking the cattle. Yet Caleb never wavered. He'd sit with Ellie at dusk, sharing stories of his childhood on the open range, coaxing her to talk about hers. Slowly, she began to open up, her voice gaining strength as she spoke of books she'd read, songs she'd loved. The turning point came one stormy night. A lightning strike sparked a fire in the barn, threatening Caleb's livestock, his livelihood. Ellie, watching from the porch, saw him race into the flames alone. Her heart pounded, useless legs pinning her in place. But then she noticed the water pump nearby, its handle just within reach. Gritting her teeth, she dragged herself from the chair, collapsing onto the muddy ground. Inch by agonizing inch, she crawled, her hands raw as she worked the pump. By the time Caleb emerged, coughing, leading the last of the cattle to safety, he found Ellie soaked and trembling, buckets of water at her side. He dropped to his knees, not to lift her but to hold her, his face buried in her hair. "You saved us," he said, and for the first time, Ellie believed she could be more than a burden. Their bond deepened, but the town's cruelty didn't relent. Hargrove, enraged by Caleb's resilience, pushed to seize his land through a rigged auction, claiming unpaid taxes. The ranch was all Caleb had, the dream he'd built from nothing. Ellie, now fiercely protective, refused to let him face it alone. She'd spent years reading, her mind sharp despite her body's limits. Digging through old town records Caleb had stored, she found proof of Hargrove's embezzlement, funds siphoned from public coffers to fund his schemes. Armed with this, she convinced Caleb to confront Hargrove at the town meeting. The idea terrified her. She hadn't faced the public since that humiliating day in the saloon. But for Caleb, she'd face anything. The meeting was a crucible. Hargrove smirked as Ellie wheeled herself to the front, the crowd whispering, some with pity, others with scorn. Caleb stood beside her, his presence a shield. Ellie's voice shook at first, but as she read the evidence aloud, it grew steady, commanding. Gasps rippled through the room. Hargrove's denials crumbled as townsfolk, shamed by their complicity, began to murmur in support. By the end, Hargrove was forced to step down, his allies slinking away. The auction was cancelled, the ranch saved. For the first time, the townsfolk saw Ellie not as a pitiable figure but as a woman of courage. Some even approached her afterward, offering quiet apologies. She didn't forgive them easily, but she nodded, choosing to move forward. Life on the ranch blossomed. Caleb and Ellie worked side by side, adapting to each other's strengths. He taught her to ride, crafting a special saddle that let her feel the wind against her face as they galloped across the plains. She taught him to see the world through her eyes, finding beauty in the small things, a hawk's shadow, a wildflower's bend. The townsfolk's attitudes shifted, slowly. Some offered help, others simply stopped staring. Caleb and Ellie didn't need their approval, but the change eased their path. They married again, this time in a quiet ceremony under the stars, no mockery, just love. Years later, the ranch became a haven for others like Ellie, people society had cast aside. Caleb built accessible cabins, and Ellie ran programs teaching skills, sharing her story. Their love had transformed not just their lives but the community around them. One evening, as they sat on the porch, Ellie looked at Caleb, now graying at the temples, and said, "They thought they'd break us." He took her hand, his grip as steady as ever. They didn't know who they were dealing with. The screen fades to black, and I step into frame, the Wyoming plains stretching behind me. Caleb and Ellie's story isn't just about love, it's about rising above cruelty, about seeing strength where others see weakness. Their journey reminds us that the greatest triumphs come from lifting each other up, no matter how heavy the world feels. What did their story stir in you? Share it below, and let's keep their spirit alive. The camera lingers on the horizon, where the sun dips low, casting a golden glow over a land that witnessed a love stronger than any joke could ever break.